Hi, everyone. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Biomedical Ethics Unit Symposium. This year, the title of the symposium is The Psychedelic Resurgence in Psychiatry, Ethics, Epistemology, and Enthusiasm. So we've got a really phenomenal lineup. This is the watch ahead video, and we'll have a live event on February 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time until 2:30. So I hope you can all join us then. So I'm Phoebe Friesen. I'm a faculty member in the Biomedical Ethics Unit and also the Department of Social Studies of Medicine at McGill. Both of these department and unit are sponsors of the event. We also have several other sponsors. So we have the Med Class of 1970, the Institute for Health and Social Policy, the Culture, Mind, and Brain Program, and the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry, all here at McGill. So I'm really grateful for all their support. So I just want to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on unceded traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. Tiohtià:ke is the traditional name for what we now call Montreal most often. And I think it's worth just thinking about the complicated and difficult relationship that McGill has had with Indigenous people over history and continues to have today. And so I think we've made a lot of strides. The institution has done a lot of work to improve relationships with Indigenous people, but there's still a long way to go. And especially given that the focus of this talk is on medicine and psychiatry in particular, it's worth thinking about how much work needs to be done in that particular domain around relationships with Indigenous people, especially in light of the recent tragic death of Joyce Echaquan at a hospital nearby in Quebec. So I know that we are online. Many of you will not be here in Montreal or Tiohtià:ke. So if you're interested in looking up which traditional territories you are located on, I can direct you to native-land.ca and you can look that up for yourself. So we're going to start with a very short contextual talk by Dr. Andrea Tone. So she's not one of our three panelists, but is actually our very own faculty member in the Department of Social Studies of Medicine. So originally, as many of you probably know, this event was meant to take place last spring at the Allen Memorial Institute, a historical building in Montreal. It was canceled, like pretty much everything that took place last spring as a result of the pandemic. And so we postponed it and are now holding it online. But I think it is really important to acknowledge, so the reason behind holding it at the Allen Memorial was because that's one of the places where some of the earliest psychedelic research took place in Canada. And so we want to grapple with our own history here at the institution and what that means today as we experience this psychedelic resurgence. So Dr. Andrea Tone is currently working on a manuscript and a book project about MK-Ultra, the infamous CIA-funded experiments involving psychedelics, some of which took place here at McGill at the Allen Memorial Institute. So what she's going to do is provide a little bit of context for us to think about what this means for us as an institution and us as Canadians. So Dr. Tone is a medical historian. She's written several award-winning books on topics that have to do with American medicine in the mid-20th century. She's also a member of the Royal Society of Canada. So what she's going to do is just give a very short talk, about 12 minutes, to provide us with a little bit more context about how particularly Dr. Ewan Cameron, one of the most infamous researchers involved in MK-Ultra at McGill, how his work was received at the time that he was alive and how differently it was received after his death. So I'll hand it over to Andrea.
Welcome, symposium participants. When my colleague Phoebe in Social Studies of Medicine first approached me about providing some historical context on the Allen and Montreal psychiatry, I said yes, also wondering and worrying about what I can meaningfully impart in the 5 to 7 minute time allocation I've been given. But I'm going to give it a go, and I'm going to share my screen and upload some visuals for your reference. I think the first place to start is to acknowledge that for many people, the history of the Allen Memorial Institute of Psychiatry, as it's formally called, is inextricably tied to the stained legacy of its first director, Donald Ewan Cameron. McGill recruited the Hopkins-trained psychiatrist in 1943 to chair its new psychiatry department. In the field, Cameron was recognized as a rising star, one of only 10 North American psychiatrists who would be asked to assess the psychiatric fitness of Rudolf Hess to stand trial at Nuremberg. He was also the author of a landmark 1935 book, Objective and Experimental Psychiatry, in which he implored fellow psychiatrists to care for patients with active treatments and not just words. Sympathy, patience, insight, rapport, Cameron wrote, these are the magic words in psychiatry. They must remain so, but only as a means to an end and not as an end in themselves. The tough-minded psychiatrists must thrust out from their enshrouding curtains to the harder realities of active treatment. At the time the book was published, North American psychiatry was still rooted in the asylum, where most practitioners would remain until the mid-1950s, when the availability of antipsychotic medications that contain the symptoms of many patients' illnesses allowed for patients who previously entertained no hope of discharge to, in fact, be let out of the hospital. Cameron brought this therapeutic mandate to McGill in 1943, where for 20 plus years he chaired the Department of Psychiatry and served as the Allen's director. In 1946, he made international news when he opened at the Allen, the first psychiatric day hospital in the world. There were no locked doors, no patient restraints, which not only bucked the tradition and historical weight of closed asylums, but communicated the very optimistic possibility that patients with serious disorders could in fact be treated on an outpatient basis, free of the stigma and the financial burdens associated with long-term custodial care. Another goal of Cameron's was to rehabilitate the reputation of psychiatry. Patients often regarded psychiatrists with suspicion and fear, but even among other medical specialties, people regularly disparaged psychiatry's documented failure to cure their patients. Heinz Lehmann, a McGill psychiatrist, recalled how in 1930 he broke the news to his surgeon father that he had decided to become a psychiatrist. His father initially thought it was a joke, but humor faded into horror when he realized his son was telling the truth. Lehmann recalled later that psychiatry in 1930 was a rather derelict career. Medical students only went into it if they couldn't get into any place else or they were alcoholic. The Allen's institutional affiliation with the Royal Victoria Hospital, and for the benefit of people who have not been to McGill's medical campus, the Royal Victoria Hospital was very close to the Allen, about a block away. And the Royal Victoria Hospital, I should add, was a general hospital. Was an important starting point for Cameron because it suggested that psychiatrists did not need to be relegated to a separate, isolated therapeutic site, but that the work that they did could and should be incorporated into mainstream psychiatry. Now, I realize that outpatient inaccessible psychiatric care, the integration of psychiatry into mainstream medicine may not seem like very bold ideas to us today, but they were regarded as such in the 1940s. The day hospital at the Allen inspired like-minded reforms in North America and abroad, and it gave the Allen, Camera, and McGill Psychiatry international visibility. After the Allen opened, and it did so with only 50 beds, Cameron would go on to bring 7 other hospitals in the vicinity into the McGill fold, many of them general hospitals where hospital administrators created integrated psychiatric units, again, collapsing the divide between the asylum and the general hospital, but also, importantly, expanding McGill psychiatry's presence in a way that created a lasting institutional infrastructure that would support the expansion of postgraduate training. By the time Cameron left Montreal in 1964, he had transformed a fledgling, unknown Department of Psychiatry into a diverse, robust, international training center with 130 residents that would soon become the single largest training program for psychiatry in the world. A few years after Cameron left in 1964, he died during a hike with his son in upstate New York. The obituaries that followed, this was in 1967, celebrated the day hospital that he had pioneered, McGill's expanding residency program, as well as Cameron's leadership of most psychiatric associations. When I say most, I'm not being hyperbolic. He was at different times the president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the Quebec Psychiatric Association, and so on. But this positive historical narrative was dislodged by the revelation 10 years later. So death in 1967, revelation in the New York Times in 1977, that during his time at McGill, specifically 1957, Cameron had accepted a grant from a front organization secretly funding mind control research for a program called MKUltra. In the tsunami of media reports that followed, Cameron was presented anew as a mad and rogue scientist practicing medicine beyond the margins, secretly and alone. Psychic driving tapes, ECT, pharmacological cocktails. How had he gotten away with it? The answer is that it wasn't a secret, because Cameron, who didn't shy away from taking credit, openly discussed what he was doing at medical conferences and published the results in medical journals. And although these techniques didn't work and were extreme and aggressive and had adverse health consequences for patients who experienced them firsthand, his contemporaries, including Heinz Lehmann, defended the ethics of Cameron's work. In 1954, Heinz Lehmann, working at the Protestant Verdun Hospital, now called the Douglas, transfixed the medical world when he reported that after weeks of taking the drug chlorpromazine, patients, mainly patients with schizophrenia, had found their symptoms pharmaceutically contained by this drug. While scholars have written extensively on how the drug chlorpromazine, brand name Thorazine, served as an endpoint for institutional psychiatry, more historical work needs to be done on how the drug's success inspired new research in pharmacotherapy in Montreal, Canada at large, in North America, and other places too. This research didn't follow a clean line or orderly path because the substances being studied kept changing, as well as the funding sources and the therapeutic end goals. New research wasn't synonymous with laboratory science in pharmaceutical companies. It included studying existing pharmaceuticals differently, as Lehmann had done, and mixing several at once, as Cameron had done. Lehmann himself did not stop with chlorpromazine. He thought it was the start of a psychopharmaceutical revolution. He experimented with LSD and other hallucinogens, caffeine, dextroamphetamine, laughing gas, and unlike Cameron, Lehmann thought that there were redeeming qualities to psychoanalysis, so he applied them to a trial that he conducted on patients housed in East House, which was a place at the Protestant Verdun Hospital for particularly difficult or unruly principals. And he used extensive talk therapy and had these patients go through early development cycles as a way of seeing if he could sort of rotate them out into a better, healthier state. It included at one point giving patients mud to help them get through the anal phase. Lehmann later admitted that one reason why this flurry of research at Montreal occurred had to do with the fact that there were no checks and balances to protect patients or to protect the scientific objectivity of the methods and results. There were no written protocols, no stated criteria for selecting patients, no placebo controls, no government permission, and no informed consent. Because my time is running out, let me just observe that the history of psychiatric research at McGill wasn't limited to Cameron or even to laymen. One reason the CIA funded not just Cameron, but multiple McGill initiatives, and why it followed individuals and research ideas that the CIA wasn't funding, along with other organizations not tied to any kind of military ambition, organizations and associations on both sides of the border. Why their eyes were on what was happening in Montreal had to do with the fact that Cameron, yes, and Heinz Lehmann, yes, but also other individuals such as Penfield and Head had individually and collectively managed to transform Montreal into a medical mecca and start, often unwittingly, really foundational research in what would become known simply as the neurosciences. I will stop there. Thank you.
Great. So thank you so much to Dr. Tone. So next up, we have our first panelist, Erika Dyck, really the historian of psychedelic science in Canada. So she's a professor at the Department of History at the University of Saskatchewan. She's also the Canada Research Chair in the History of Medicine, has been inducted into the Royal Society of Canada as well. So her book, Psychedelic Psychiatry, LSD from Clinic to Campus, I can't recommend enough. It documents the psychedelic science that was taking place in Canada, particularly in Saskatchewan in the mid-20th century, and is an absolutely fascinating piece of work. She's also starting a new book. She's done a lot in the meantime, but right now she has a collection of essays on the global history of psychedelics that's in progress. So you can all check that out when it's available. So her talk is titled Psychedelics, Renaissance or Flashback. So I'll hand it over to her.
Hello, my name is Erika Dyck. I am happy to be part of your meeting today, and I am going to talk to you about the history of psychedelics, Renaissance or flashback. Hopefully my screen will cooperate. I started working on the history of psychedelics as a medical historian about 20 years ago. And when I first started exploring this history, what I found is that many people asked me whether I was studying an American counterculture, whether I was studying the recreational use of psychedelics, or a black market circulation of acid or LSD. And when I went to the library to find out what had been written about the history of psychedelics at that time, this was in the early 2000s, there are a number of different books in there, many of which were written by journalists, very few by scholars looking at critical history of this topic, and many of them concentrated on conspiratorial aspects of this history. So perhaps most notably, the history of the CIA's use in funding experiments associated with mind control, but also in infiltration techniques that were done to infiltration into countercultural activities, looking at how people were taking LSD or acid as part of the anti-Vietnam War protest. And there are a number of commissions that gave sources that provided historians and journalists with information about how to understand the role that psychedelics had played in a Cold War period of espionage and mind control. In terms of popular culture and films, I saw there was a film produced in 1968 called LSD Insight or Insanity. And you can see this film free. It's available from the National Library of Medicine at Bethesda, Maryland in the United States. And in this film, they claim to go through a number of exposés using testimony from psychiatrists who in the 1960s were very much against the use of LSD. And they show, this is a story of how young college age or university youth begin taking LSD and how it leads to violence and in some cases suicide. And we see in the world of sort of public health literature and in the films that were produced at this time, a real emphasis on showing the dangers associated with the use of psychedelics in particular, as they cause the brain to atrophy or actually cause violence and terrible, dangerous outbreaks. These are all very interesting stories, but what really captivated my interest in this history was a period that predates this, this phase or this characterization of psychedelics as inherently dangerous, as public pariahs, or as menaces, as this image indicates. This is the front page of a Toronto-based newspaper from 1961, and I think it helps us to sort of situate this moment. On the top left-hand corner of the page, we see Russia puts first man in space, reminding us of this Cold War tension and the moment in time. But down further closer to the middle or the right-hand side of the paper, it was folded, so this would have still been in the middle part of the paper, was LSD, miracle drug or menace. I was really interested in what kinds of information or what kinds of studies were done that led people to believe that this could in fact be a miracle drug prior to it tipping over into the category of menace as it became known after a while. And to do this, I started exploring a variety of different ways that these substances had been used even before the word psychedelic was coined in 1957. One such example is, of course, looking at traditional uses. This is an image of a peyote ceremony that was conducted in 1956. So it is not actually really predating this period, but it's a publicly available image that I can use to show how people came together to understand ritual and ceremonies and the use of plant-based healers in ways that caused reactions, both in terms of mental healing, but also in spiritual healing, and in ways that I think very much influenced some of the early psychedelic research in the 1950s. We know, for example, that there were researchers since at least the end of the 19th century who were very interested in what kinds of things could be learned from these plant-based medicines or these plant-based chemicals. We have Heinrich Kluver, for example, looking at mescaline and trying to understand how taking mescaline caused hallucinations and what those hallucinations might reveal to the careful observer. And of course, we come across the story of Albert Hofmann, who was working at Sandoz Pharmaceutical Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland, when he stumbled upon or discovered LSD, or D-lysergic acid diethylmide. I won't go deeply into this story because I'm sure everyone here is familiar with his discovery, and I just want to acknowledge some of the tribute art that was created on his 100th birthday as he continued to reflect on LSD, his problem child, which was the title of his autobiography in his book about LSD, where he continued to feel rather conflicted, both very enthusiastic about the promise that it held, but also conflicted about some of the reactions to psychedelics and to LSD in particular. I want to sort of explore this as a historian now, and I want to sort of place psychedelics in their historical space. Dr. Hofmann's discovery of LSD, according to Stanislav Grof, who I've quoted here, generated a powerful wave of interest in brain chemistry, and together with the development of tranquilizers, was directly responsible for what has been called the golden age of psychopharmacology. Now, far beyond Stanislav Grof, other historians and psychopharmacologists have pointed to the 1950s as a really significant period within the history of psychiatry, and particularly within the history of psychopharmacology. The 1950s represented a moment in time when we saw the introduction of some of the first blockbuster medications in psychopharmacology. And people like David Healy, a psychopharmacologist and historian in the UK, argues that this decade actually witnessed the greatest number of new psychopharmacological products that entered the market ever. Sorry, it was the first time that they had entered the market, and there were more psychopharmaceutical products that entered the market in the 1950s than ever before or since. And so I think it's important to bear in mind that the discovery of LSD, or the introduction of LSD into psychiatric research, occurred at a time when many, many, many other kinds of drugs, some of the first antipsychotics, the first tranquilizers, some of the sedatives that were being elaborated on were introduced also at this time. And if we look through medical periodicals at the time, medical literature, we see thousands of ads flooding the pages. So physicians are inundated with ads for different psychopharmaceutical products that can help to aid in mental health treatments, but also in terms of the changing the environment for experimenting with different psychopharmaceutical products. So I want to now take this story to Saskatchewan, which happens to be where I live and where I grew up, but that is not the only reason why I want to talk to you about it today. In 1944, Saskatchewan elected what was described as the first socialist government in North America. The government was elected on the promise of bringing publicly funded healthcare to its citizens, and ultimately it lived up to this promise, and through a number of different stages of legislation, publicly funded healthcare, or Medicare as Canadians now call it, was introduced in this province. As part of those reforms, one of the things that happened was a focus on psychiatric research. And one of the fellows in this picture, Humphrey Osmond, he's the one sitting to the right of the man in the red shirt. Humphrey Osmond was a British-trained psychiatrist who was invited to come to Saskatchewan to participate in some of these reforms. And he headed up some of the psychiatric research at the time. And he ultimately is who I'm going to focus a little bit of this story on. And I'll return to this image here, or not to the image, I'll return to this story in just a moment, but I want to emphasize that there were a period of political reforms that were also influencing the kind of healthcare research that was taking place at mid-century, alongside the introduction of these psychopharmaceutical products. Humphrey Osmond came to Saskatchewan in 1951, and he brought with him a real curiosity about what LSD might do for mental health research. He developed two main arms of his research. One was to explore psychedelics. Sorry, I shouldn't say psychedelics. He hadn't coined the word yet. To explore drugs like mescaline and LSD as a psychomimetic, or something that would mimic schizophrenia or mimic psychotic disorders. He was the superintendent of one of the largest mental hospitals in the province, certainly the largest one in the province, one of the largest ones in the country, and he felt that schizophrenic patients or those with psychotic disorders were the most dominant part of the patient population. They were the most numerous. And he felt if he could give staff, social workers, nurses, psychiatrists, psychologists, if he could give them an empathetic experience, if they could understand what it was like to have schizophrenia by taking LSD, they might become better healthcare providers. And that was one arm of his research. The second arm is around alcoholism, and I'll get into that in just a moment. In 1953, Sidney Katz, a reporter from Toronto, visited Saskatchewan to participate in an LSD experiment so that he could broadcast this to Canadian readers in Maclean's magazine, which was a major English language press that circulated throughout the country. Here's an example of some of what he says in his 12-page article about his LSD experiment. I will never be able to describe fully what happened to me during my excursion into madness. There are no words in the English language designed to convey the sensations I felt, or the visions, illusions, hallucinations, colors, patterns, and dimensions which my disordered mind revealed. So this sort of taps into this idea that you can plunge someone into an experience that disorders their thoughts, that makes them question their own judgment or their own logic. And Osmond argued that this was what it felt like to have schizophrenia. And so rather than give LSD to schizophrenic patients, he urged healthcare workers to try LSD as a way of better understanding their patients. That search for an English word to describe the feelings, though, was unquenched in Osmond. By 1953, he had caught the attention of British author Aldous Huxley, who had by then relocated to Los Angeles in California. Huxley invited Osmond to come and visit him in his home in Los Angeles, which he did, and Osmond brought mescaline with him on their first trip. No pun intended. He parted on his first visit to Aldous Huxley. They began a lifelong, which ended up being 10 years longer before Aldous Huxley died in 1963. They began a very close friendship. They wrote letters quite frequently. And you can read these in a book called Psychedelic Prophets, which is a full collection of their letters. And of course, it was also punctuated by visits. Here's just an example. I don't expect you to read the text, but I wanted to show you how these two men came up with the word psychedelic. You can see in the typewritten letter, this is from Aldous Huxley, that he has written at the bottom of it, he says phenerethyme, substantive, phenerothymic, adjective. And he says in a rhyming couplet, to make this trivial world sublime, take half a gram of phenerothyme. And Osmond, upon receiving that letter, already jotted down his own response. To plumb the depths or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And you can see him in his own letter then responding in the handwritten version, where he elaborates on this and he changes the rhyme just a little bit. To fathom hell or go angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. So here we have the first use of the word psychedelic, the coining of the word psychedelic, if you will, in a very intimate relationship between Huxley and Osmond. It was later published by Osmond in 1957 in the New York Academy of Sciences Journal, and that was the launching of the word psychedelic into the English lexicon. We know, of course, that Aldous Huxley went on to explore psychedelics in a more meaningful way and introduced all sorts of other people to his voyages through his work in The Doors of Perception, a book that he wrote within a month after meeting Osmond and after having his first mescaline experience. So it was very interesting to use psychedelics in this context as an empathetic trigger or as a way of trying to understand what other people were going through, particularly those people with psychotic disorders. But the other application was through addictions, and primarily that was through alcoholism. So we saw at the time there was quite a contest amongst researchers in addictions research, arguing as to whether alcoholism was a disease, something that required medical intervention, or whether it was a personality problem that required a different kind of set of supports, one that was not punctuated by medical interventions. So we see even this example from E.M. Jelinek at Yale University arguing that alcoholism is a disease that deserves medical attention. Sort of on the other side of that to some degree was Bill W. He was the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, or Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, who pioneered this 12-step program. Of course, 12-step programs have been around and were not exclusive to Alcoholics Anonymous, but Alcoholics Anonymous remained the leading intervention for alcoholism or for alcohol substance use disorder, as it later became known. Bill W., though, ruminated on this and felt that one of the challenges with Alcoholics Anonymous was getting people to stay with the program. They had very good success rates, almost 50% success rates for people, and this was mostly men in the 1950s, who stayed with the program, but getting them to join the program in the first place, and particularly to get through step 2, was a very difficult step. So in one of the issues of Alcoholics Anonymous Blue Book, or their Bible, if you will, step 2 is described as, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. The work that was being done by psychedelic researchers at the time suggested that often people had what was described as a spiritual experience. Some people faced God, some people articulated it and expressed it as facing God, while others felt it was an overwhelmingly emotional experience that they described in spiritual terms. So there's not a real level of consistency or coherence on how spirituality is expressed through psychedelics at this time, but it raised the attention of Bill W., who reached out to researchers in Saskatchewan and sought an LSD experience himself, quietly and discreetly, so as not to compromise his leadership in Alcoholics Anonymous. He agreed that psychedelics might be a way of helping people to reach that spiritual depth in order for them to seek the help and receive the help they needed from Alcoholics Anonymous. People like Humphrey Osmond in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and his colleague Abram Hoffer, who was in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. So by today's standards, these are not particularly far apart, but it was a 5 or 6 hour drive between these places. So they wrote letters very, very frequently, almost daily, during the 1950s as they worked through these issues together, both of whom were psychiatrists, and they both agreed that alcoholism might be benefited by using psychedelics to help people achieve a kind of insight into their disorder, into their behavior, before their bodies physiologically were damaged by excessive alcohol use. We have some images here. Most of these are staged photographs. This is from Sidney Katz, the journalist who came to see him. It's not a real patient, but I wanted to include this to show you an example of how these trials and how these experiments took place. So in the case of the alcoholism treatments, individuals were never left alone. They were always accompanied by at least one, if not multiple, empathetic therapists. And I say empathetic by means therapists who had their own psychedelic experience. Patients were left to freely move about the room. And these are some examples, not from Sidney Katz, but this one comes from a nurse who was observing a patient and describes he had a momentary oneness with God, had a vision while lying down with eyes closed of a spiral staircase and himself talking to another person. This appeared to have great meaning to him. He seems to have gained some insight and understanding of himself. So they recognized that people had insights into their behavior, sometimes, as you see here, ones that readily invoke a kind of God or spiritual reaction, and they felt that this in itself was meaningful. By following up patients for 2 years after a single dose psychedelic therapy combined with psychotherapy, they found that they had success rates and success was measured in strict abstinence. Success rates of 30 to 90%. And that includes a 2-year follow-up. It often involved patients who either reconnected with their families or rebuilt relationships, who were able to gain employment. There were a variety of different things that were measured in these success rates, but abstinence was key to that. At the time, in the province of Saskatchewan, this was welcomed heartily, certainly by the premier, who I've pictured here with his fists up, Tommy Douglas, who had campaigned on a promise of bringing healthcare to Saskatchewan residents and later to Canadians across the country. A single dose psychedelic therapy represented a fiscally responsible intervention for a government that was keen on promoting a healthcare that would be funded entirely by the state. Returning people to work, returning people to their families was also something that was very much attractive to a government intent on supporting the rehabilitation of sick members of their society. The other icons that I include here, I want to just indicate that there was also support from things like Alcoholics Anonymous. In some regions throughout North America, Alcoholics Anonymous did not want to openly support the use of psychedelics. But in Saskatchewan, they advertised psychedelic therapy in their local newsletters and circulated this to their members as a way of showing how they endorsed this therapy. Temperance reformers were also convinced that psychedelics with a one therapy session was okay to support temperance and to promote stability within families. I should mention that alcoholism treatment at this time was primarily focused on men. The symbol of a church here is also to invoke the idea that a lot of care for alcoholism had fallen to the church prior to this moment, and this runs across different denominations, but churches as seeking a kind of spiritual guidance or a spiritual way to hold families together or to support families. And yet again, with the introduction of psychedelics, you might think that there may be some resistance or hesitancy to support such a therapy, but here we saw a number of church leaders actually coming out in favor of psychedelic therapy, in part because they recognized the realignment with a spiritual self. And some church leaders felt that this would be a promising way to bring people back into church services. There were other applications of psychedelics that also began to blossom in this environment in a province that supported sustained psychedelic research and protected these researchers in some ways. And here's one example. This is from an architect named Kiyoshi Izumi. He said he took LSD and went wandering through the halls of the Gothic-styled asylum to try to understand how space and the space of mental hospitals actually exacerbated certain psychotic disorders. So here you see, this was from a newspaper that was published in Ottawa, where he says, "I saw a crack in the wall and it frightened me. I imagined it was a huge crevice." This is a typical fear suffered by schizophrenics. So Izumi went on this project where he looked to reforming psychiatric hospitals based on the idea that LSD could give him insight into how patients experience their environment, and that he could alter designs and create more sensitive environments to help people move more freely through those environments and to minimize the kind of reactions that they had. By 1956, Osmond and these others around him, Hoffer and a few other researchers, also recognized that there was a lot to be learned and a lot to be gained from paying attention to some of the traditional ceremonies that had used these plant medicines in the past. So in 1956, they participated in a peyote ceremony upon invitation from the Native American Church of Canada. There was one registered chapter of the NAC, and that was in Saskatchewan. So they traveled to North Battleford, which was several hours away by car, and they participated in a peyote ceremony. And I have a few images from that ceremony. It's very clear that this ceremony was crafted in a way to present a very careful face or a careful image of this ceremony to the federal government. The federal government was inquiring peyote ceremonies at this time. They were looking into them as to whether or not they actually were justified. And this is where I have some of these images from. So I believe everyone was on their best behavior this weekend. It was a 2-day ceremony that was, of course, part of it was taking peyote, but it was also punctuated at the end by a feast and a gathering of some of the different chapters of the Native American Church ceremony. One of these men, the man with the bone pipe, Frank Takes Gun, came from Montana, and you can see Humphrey Osmond to his left, the man in the glasses there. I can talk a little bit more about the peyote ceremony in questions if there are questions, but I indicate that mostly to emphasize that the psychedelic researchers were curious about how these substances had been used in the past, how they were honored, what they meant in terms of a spiritual salve. They also spoke directly and openly about the wounds caused by colonialism and how psychedelics had the potential to help us learn about each other and help to promote a kind of tolerance. And some of the language that they used at the time is actually quite resonant today, particularly as we live in this COVID moment and see eruptions of all sorts of tensions, some of which are quite deeply racialized. But what I want to move on to now is what happens as there was sort of a tremendous amount of promise and optimism that was held up in the psychedelic therapy that was progressing throughout the 1950s, and that changed. And I think it changed quite dramatically. In 1962, the Canadian Food and Drug Agency placed thalidomide on a banned substances list. Canada is, of course, not alone in this. The United States did not approve thalidomide, so it responds a little bit differently. But we know throughout Europe and many places, thalidomide really shook the public's trust or the public understanding of where scientists were making good decisions about the risks that the public was being exposed to. This also comes at the same time that Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, was published, introducing readers to the catastrophic effects of dumping chemicals into our environment. And I think there's a real sort of awakening or in a moment where there's public consciousness is alive to the idea that scientists and physicians do not fully appreciate the risks of introducing chemicals or psychopharmaceuticals to a consuming public. In this particular moment in Canada, Canadian drug regulators put thalidomide on not a banned substances list entirely, but a list, a Schedule H, which was an entirely new designation for medical products that may require more investigation before they can be doled out to the public. And they put LSD on this list with very little conversation and very little examination. Physicians, psychiatrists, and psychologists, all of whom had their own associations, banded together in a relatively unprecedented moment where they came together and challenged the government's position on this regulation. They argued that, in fact, scientists and clinicians and psychologists are better positioned to make designations about risk than government officials. And some of these images represent some of the debates, the public debates that were taking place. This particular one was a televised debate where they were arguing that indeed it should be the purview of physicians or the medical community, the medical scientific community, to determine the risks. The same thing happened in the United States. Senator Bob Dole issued an inquiry looking into how to deal with some of these alarming concerns about how chemicals were being consumed or encountered in our communities. Also in 1962, Timothy Leary became known to a reading public throughout North America. Again, of course, the epicenter of this was at Harvard University, where Timothy Leary had been a psychologist and a psychology professor. And at the end of 1961, he was fired from his job for engaging in what was described as unethical use of psychedelics. He was rather unfazed by this by some accounts, and it sort of catapulted him into the spotlight. And the way that I've tried to measure this is that prior to Timothy Leary's appearance in the public conversation, there were a handful of articles at any given time in the New York Times or in major Canadian newspapers where I had focused my research. Only a handful of articles about LSD or mescaline or psychedelics at all. After Timothy Leary loses his job, he seems to go on a bit of a personal crusade to make the world aware and to liven up, become aware of LSD and an acid revolution. He, of course, coins the term turn on, tune in, drop out. And his face and his language and his message becomes front page news, such that there are 500 or 600 articles about LSD that start to spill into pages of newspapers throughout the United States at this time. 1962 is also a time when Sandoz Pharmaceuticals Laboratories recognizes that there are all sorts of copycat versions of LSD or D-lysergic acid circulating primarily in underground contexts. So a black market in acid is clearly present. Sandoz becomes worried about this and begins to withdraw its supplies from legitimate researchers, and at the same time, police action increases in a variety of areas. And we see this in a most pronounced way in California, where the black market circulation has become known to police, but this ricochets through a variety of different communities. We start to see public health ads picking up after 1962, showing that LSD is dangerous, and you start to see this in tandem now with an emerging war on drugs idea about pushing acid, pushing LSD and psychedelics more broadly into the recreational, black market, dangerous category, away from medical use or medical potential. In Canada, Canadian researchers retained permission to use LSD as a experimental compound until 1968 officially, but many research units closed or moved away from psychedelic research, finding that it was very difficult to get access to naive drug users or first-time drug users who could give them a more appropriate response to measure reactions. What they found is that more and more people were seeking a safe place to take LSD, and so they sought that out through clinical experiments. Ultimately, by 1968, there are a number of jurisdictions around the world that are starting to give greater restrictions on LSD, and Canada is not any different. Senator Molson, who was one of the godfathers, if you will, of Canada's major brewing industry, introduced or helped to introduce one of the bills that would ban LSD from research at that time. So by way of moving into a conclusion now, I want to say that when I finished this work I finished my doctoral work on this project in 2005, and a few years later, I was publishing this revised version of this for a book. And at that time, as a historian, I thought I had, sort of ended this part of my career and I would move on to something else. But it coincided, unbeknownst to me, it coincided with David Nutt releasing a new harm scale in The Lancet as one example, but there's, and I think we know as we're part of this conversation here today, there has been a really dramatic shift in the way that psychedelics are being described both in medical and scientific literature, but also in the popular consciousness. And I think we're starting to see that changing dramatically. David Nutt, for example, argued that we need to reclassify and rethink the way we understand drug harm, so that drugs like alcohol and tobacco, for example, are much more expensive when we think about the impact on healthcare systems, and they have many more chronic diseases associated with them. By comparison, he said psychedelics actually represent very, very limited harms when we think about those kinds of comparisons. I've just chosen a few examples here, but there are literally hundreds, if not thousands now, of examples of researchers using psychedelics who are becoming part of a popular discussion about their potential use. This is a picture of Stephen Ross from Science Magazine, where he is being interviewed for his work using psilocybin to treat end-of-life care or the end-of-life anxiety associated with cancer diagnoses. Psychedelic Science is a conference that was the largest conference or largest gathering of psychedelic scientists in the 21st century. And it's even larger than those that existed in the 1950s. And if we think about the relative numbers of people involved, it's probably comparable. But over 3,000 people gathered to participate in a conference in Oakland, California in 2017. And these, I'm just giving you a few examples here. Here's one in the UK, Breaking Convention, also a very large gathering. We see psychedelics being described in positive ways, very different from those public health ads that say, you know, drop your acid in a urinal or just say no. But we have people now challenging that narrative, including best-selling author Michael Pollan, who describes his own LSD experience, sorry, not LSD experience, his own psychedelic experiences in 4 different categories in his book. Tim Ferriss has sort of come out in support of this. Some of these sort of public personalities whose testimonies are now shaping the way we think, I believe, about psychedelics. Last year, we saw that Johns Hopkins University has opened a new Center for Psychedelic Research. I think that probably 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago, it would be unheard of to imagine a major American university supporting this kind of research. But I think this is further proof that the conversation is changing quite dramatically. So by way of conclusion, I want to say as a historian, it's very fascinating to be able to look back at some of this history and then think about what lessons we might take from that history and what pieces we might bring forward. I'm not convinced that we necessarily have sorted out how to regulate psychedelics, under what circumstances psychedelics should be promoted, whether they should be entirely medicalized, whether they should be openly commercialized, whether they should be accessible to all ages, whether they should be self-prescribed or only taken with a physician's permission. I think there are still a lot of questions that were left unanswered in an earlier generation of psychedelic research. And I think we are now in a really interesting moment for exploring these questions. We have a different sense of acceptance of psychopharmaceutical products in our lives. And I think we have a growing resistance or critique of the way that psychopharmaceutical products have been brought into our lives over the past 75 years. And I think we need to lean into these moments and we need to think about the way that we want to accept these, not only the chemicals, but the kinds of messages that they bring. So whether we explore psychedelics because they have an inherent spiritual context, or whether we reject psychedelics because we prefer a profit-driven model of psychopharmaceuticals that we take every day. I think there are a lot of really interesting moments here that psychedelics provide us a really rich intellectual space for thinking about where we prioritize healthcare needs, where we prioritize harm reduction needs in our communities, and how we work with governments to ensure that we all have safe access to mental health services. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Erika. So next up, we have Mark Haden, an adjunct professor at the School of Population and Public Health at UBC, University of British Columbia. He's spent over 28 years providing support for those using substances and has been really involved in thinking about drug policy reform in Canada. He's also recently been involved in a lot of the new research initiatives around psychedelic sciences in Canada, and crucially is the executive director of MAPS Canada. So MAPS being the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So his talk is titled Psychedelics, the Path Forward.
Hi there, my name is Mark Haden. I'm the Executive Director of MAPS Canada, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. We're a branch of MAPS USA, and we support their multi-site research. We fund research in Canada. We are public educators. We essentially explore the science and offer the science to the Canadian public. And yeah, we're 400 volunteers and 2 staff members. We're a tiny organization that is very loud. So welcome to the world of MAPS Canada. Thank you. This is my welcome slide. It says welcome in many different languages. I'd like to talk about, speaking of language, I'd like to talk about why we use the word psychedelic, because that word is intentionally chosen by the research community. We had many choices. Psychomimetic was the first word to use to describe psychedelics back in the 50s. It means like psychosis. Hallucinogen means creating visions. Empathogen means increasing empathy, and entheogen means manifesting of the spirit. The first 2 are negatively weighted, the last 2 are positively weighted. The most neutral term and the most accurate term, which is manifesting of the mind, is psychedelic, and it's been consciously chosen by the research community to describe the work that they do. If I share one slide to legitimize our work, it's this one. This is the logos of the universities that are producing papers, peer-reviewed journal articles on psychedelics, and it goes from Harvard Medical School to Johns Hopkins to Stanford. I'm now working with somebody at UBC to do a survey, so UBC has been added to this list. There's a group in Toronto that's doing psychedelics, so many universities are engaged with the process of psychedelic research. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov, where people list their research, and you search for the word psychedelic, you find 289 studies. In fact, I searched for that in November of 2019, and there was 289. It had gone up. When I searched in early 2020, it had gone up to 298. When I searched for the word psilocybin, I found 39 studies, and that had gone up to 45 in February of 2020. When I searched for the word MDMA, I found 76 studies that had gone up to 79 in February of 2020. And when I searched for the word LSD, I found 96 studies that had gone up to 100 in 2020. Another way of looking at that is the Web of Science analysis of their publications. And you can notice that there has been an explosion of interest in psychedelic research. Even the FDA in the United States is interested in psychedelics because so many people are working with them. So there was a slideshow that they did internally, and this is a slide from their PowerPoint presentation, bridging the past, the present, and the future of psychedelic drug development, psychedelic drug research and development. Curiously enough, even the veterans, specifically in the United States, are interested in psychedelics because quite a bit of the MAPS work has been focused on engaging veterans, and some of the most public spokespeople for psychedelic research in the United States have been veterans. So here's the veteran magazine. This is your brain on drug-assisted psychotherapy, and veterans have been very positive about psychedelics. If I was going to choose a date that represented the beginning of the psychedelic renaissance, I would choose April 11th of 2010, where the New York Times Magazine, which was the first mainstream popular media that I noticed, that actually had a discussion about the new research. And hallucinogens have doctors tuning in again was the name of the article. That was the beginning, and then it just exploded. The New York Times Magazine, how psychedelic drugs can help patients face death. And again, the New York Times, can mushrooms treat depression? And in terms of legitimacy in Canada, I did a little dance when this particular CMAJ article or magazine was published, because they chose to put the psychedelic renaissance on their front cover. As you know, the Canadian Medical Association Journal is the conservative voice of physicians across Canada. And there was a few articles in here on the psychedelic renaissance. In terms of popular press, Michael Pollan, who was a foodie and a very popular author, when he wrote a book called How to Change Your Mind, it really brought a whole new constituency to our discussion. And Michael Pollan accurately and persuasively described the research, had his own personal experiences, which he linked to the research and wrote in a very compelling way. For those who are beginning in this field and they ask for one book to read, this is the one that I suggest. If you're interested in watching how a psychedelic group can be managed, the Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop show had a session on psychedelics, and curiously enough, this American program reached out to Canadians, and we had a discussion with her. And I quite liked how she did it. I thought it was respectful of the process. If you want to watch one film on how psychedelic psychotherapy actually works in outside of the research context, in a more ceremonial process, this particular film is compelling. It was about a woman in Vancouver who was a heroin addict, and she happened to know a number of film producers, and they got together, and she said she wanted to engage in a healing journey and the psychedelics would be her path. And they asked if they could video her through the entire process, and she said yes. And it was not simple. It was a complex, turbulent journey that worked out well, but it really shows the complexity of the healing journey on psychedelics. If there was one media that I would think would be most aggressive to us and not supportive, it would be Fox News. But curious enough, Fox News has actually been very supportive, partly because the Americans reach out and heal veterans, and Fox News is very pro-veteran. So curious enough, bizarrely enough, Fox News has been supportive of psychedelic research. I'd like to reflect on how researchers understand psychedelics, because they break psychedelics down into three groups. There's the classical psychedelics, LSD, mescaline, which is found in peyote, psilocybin, which is found in magic mushrooms, and DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is the main ingredient of ayahuasca. Now, what the classical psychedelics offer is often an intense spiritual experience that often has elements of meaning and purpose as well. There's an element of disorientation of the ego, which can be scary for some, but when used appropriately is very, very helpful in the treatment of things like addictions and alcoholism, because the belief systems that drinking 26er of vodka every night is rooted in the ego, and disorienting that belief system is actually very helpful in the healing process. They are unconscious amplifiers, which means when we take these substances, we have access to our unconscious material. Our unconscious mind becomes permeable to us. There's a huge portal effect with the classical psychedelics. By portal effect, I mean it's a bit like climbing Mount Everest or graduating from high school or university. There's a sense of accomplishment and transition that is huge. And when used skillfully, that portal effect is very helpful in transitions away from whatever people were transitioning away from, be it depression or addiction or something else. Substance use disorder treatment, depression treatment, end-of-life anxiety treatment are the main research interests for the classical psychedelics today. And then there's the empathogens, which means connecting to others, or entactogens, which means connecting to oneself. And what these offer are connections to others, and also a deep reflection on self, a deep ability to understand one's unconscious mind, an ability to go into one's inner recesses and explore them. There's also a reduction of fear. So with PTSD treatment specifically, it's an unconscious tape loop which is encrusted with fear. So being able to access that tape loop without a huge fear response is why the treatment for PTSD is so effective when used with MDMA. Examples of empathogens are MDMA, methylene deoxyamphetamine, or methylene deoxymethamphetamine, or MDA, which is methylene deoxyamphetamine, or 3-MMC, which is 3-methylmethcathinone. The third group of psychedelics is basically everything else. And included in this group is ibogaine, which is very helpful for detoxification of heroin and treatment of heroin addiction, ketamine, which is helpful for depression, 2CB, salvia divinorum. There's a whole range of other psychedelics, and they have different promises for different kind of indications. LSD is to the study of the mind what the telescope is to astronomy, and the microscope is to biology. Dr. Stanislav Grof made that statement quite a while ago now, and he is arguably the godfather of LSD. I'd like to talk about the main research that I'm involved with, which is the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. And it started with a study by Michael and Annie Mithofer, where they demonstrated the level of effectiveness for their therapeutic technique in treating PTSD of an 83% level of effectiveness. Now, compare that to a normal treatment effectiveness of PTSD is somewhere between 10 and 25%, depending on the research that you're looking at. Now, normally, when somebody is proposing a new model of therapy that is that much different from the existing therapy, from 10 to 25% to 83% is a huge leap. Normally, when somebody's proposing that level of a leap, the accusation is they're falsifying their data, they're lying. And so how did they prove that they weren't? Well, they had to do a phase 2 study in many countries, including Canada and the United States. And there had to be lots of oversight in Canada with Health Canada, in the United States with the FDA. And they did, and the FDA accepted their data, and they basically weren't falsifying their data. In their phase 2 release of their data, they observed that the comparator dose, the placebo response, was 23% level of effectiveness. Now, what that actually tells you is the therapists were pretty good, because that's a very high, for a non-psychoactive experience, that's a pretty good treatment response. At the 2-month follow-up, it had gone up to 55%. For 2 sessions, people can either have 1, 2, or 3 MDMA sessions. And so at the 2 sessions, it was 55% level of effectiveness. With 3 sessions, it had gone up to 61% level of effectiveness. And at the long-term follow-up, it had gone up again to 67.8% level of effectiveness. So what that tells you is absolutely fascinating. What it says is people continued to heal even after the therapeutic process was over. It also shows that Michael and Annie Mithofer were actually telling the truth about their data. Some of the lessons that were learned in the phase 2 studies is the cause for PTSD is irrelevant. People can have many different experiences that create their PTSD, and it doesn't matter. The MDMA study is helpful for all of them. Low doses of MDMA are actually anti-therapeutic. A small amount of MDMA provides a small stimulant response, and that can increase anxiety and doesn't give you enough of the MDMA experience to actually have a therapeutic effect. Safety was established, and it was a medium to large effect size in the clinically administered PTSD scales, or the CAPS score, which is how the PTSD is measured. Another interesting lesson from the MDMA work is positive treatment outcomes are not correlated with mystical experiences. That is completely different from the classical work. The work with the classical psychedelics, psilocybin most commonly, the mystical experience is highly correlated with positive treatment outcomes. They measure on a MEQ, the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, and those folks that have very high MEQ scores tend to be the ones that either quit tobacco or have their depression reduced. And so it's interesting because the mystical experience is highly correlated with the classical psychedelics, but it's not correlated at all with MDMA work. So it's a really different process. The phase 3 study was granted breakthrough designation by the FDA in the United States, which is absolutely huge. So what that really says is the FDA took a really hard look at the data. And what they observed was the positive effect was significant enough that they wanted to speed up the access of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder in the States, and they would reduce their regulatory hurdles to allow that to occur. Here's their study design if you're interested, which was there are either 1, 2, or 3 sessions with increasing dosages, starting out with 80 milligrams and going up to an optional 120. There were 3 prep sessions, 9 integrated psychotherapy sessions, and then a 2-month follow-up. The phase 3 sites are in both Canada and the United States, and you can see many of the sites from San Francisco, Montreal. Actually, the Montreal site unfortunately closed. Simon Amar's wife persuaded him to move to Australia, which is unfortunate for our research. But you can see the list of cities where this is a multi-site trial. The potential to have sites in Europe is also being explored, and here are the different countries that are being explored and the specific cities in the countries. One of the most important checks or reality checks of Rick Doblin's career was when they unblinded the phase 3 data. That's the point at which the FDA essentially gives the whole process a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And they looked at Rick Doblin's, the MAPS' data, and the FDA agreed that they could move forward. Now, that sounds logical and reasonable, but that does not always happen. Tonix, for example, was also working on a drug for PTSD, and they had spent $100 million on it. And when they unblinded their phase 3 data, the FDA said, no, the signal to noise ratio is not large enough, and you can't continue this, and they lost their money and they closed their study. In Vancouver, we did our phase 2 study that was completed. 6 people were treated with 2 teams of therapists. In the phase 3 study, they've so far treated 4 of 11 with 2 to 3 teams of therapists. And we're partnering with an organization in Vancouver who's hosting that study for us, which is the BCCSU. So we're working on a process of legalizing MDMA in Canada. The Americans have a process called a right to try legislation. And that's very different from the special access program, which has historically been blocked in Canada, which would allow us to start treating people outside of the research study. We have been working, MAPS Canada has been working very closely with some Health Canada contacts and observing to them that it doesn't make sense to have psychedelics blocked from the special access program. And they've eventually agreed to do a public consultation on that. And that will end February 11th this year, 2021. And we hope that MDMA will then be allowed to be rolled out parallel to the research process that is unfolding. So we're actually planning on training Canadian therapists. In fact, I'm right now asking for names of Canadian therapists who would like to be trained and will be able to provide that service outside of the research context, hopefully fairly soon. So MAPS will be training licensing therapists and selling MDMA to facilities across Canada in the context of prescription and trained therapists. I'd like to observe that it's going to be expensive because of the cost of 2 therapists, a male and a female therapist, master's level trained and above, is expensive. And we're having a lot of discussions about how to deal with that. We also are supporting an eating disorder study. that we believe that we can treat eating disorders because eating disorders have the roots of trauma, which we know that we can treat. Body dysmorphia, which is the difference between what somebody sees in the mirror and what somebody else sees. We believe we can treat that. Family conflict is also a root of eating disorders, so we believe that we can treat that. Anxiety, that we believe that's treatable by us. The last driver of eating disorders is society's views of women's bodies, and that we can't treat. So 4 of the 5 drivers to eating disorders, we actually think we can treat. And so we've decided to have an eating disorder process happening. And it's so far 3 sites. It's in Toronto, Vancouver, and Denver, Colorado. It's funded by a Canadian, which I'm really thrilled with. And we believe that we'll be able to treat a very significant mental health disorder that is often fatal. And our process is to demonstrate that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is effective for as many indications as possible. And then what will happen, we believe, is the off-label window, the use of it for a variety of different indications that are related to the indications we prove that it's helpful for. So we would really like it to be widely used for many indications, and this is our process. Here's a photo of Adele LaFrance, who's one of the leaders of our eating disorder study. We're also supporting Anne Wagner's work. She has 2 different research processes she's involved with. One is cognitive processing therapy, and one is couples work, both within the context of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. It's absolutely fascinating because she'll be giving MDMA to 2 people, both in a couple, one of whom has PTSD. She's associated with Ryerson University in Toronto. Here's a study that I think is absolutely fascinating. It was Griffith's work looking at the mystical experience and his 14th month later follow-up. Now, I understand that this is slide from hell. If you ever take a course on how to do PowerPoint, they say, don't do this. So I'd like to apologize, but the numbers are so important. If you look at the column second to the left, it says 30 above it. That was the 30 milligram dosage. And then you look at the 14-month follow-up, which is the right-hand column, and you look at the issues of positive attitudes towards life, positive attitudes towards self, positive mood changes, increased sense of spirituality, how meaningful was the experience, and how spiritual was the experience. What you see is in all of those variables at the 14th month follow-up, the numbers had gone up. They had gone up from after the treatment experience. Now, I actually can't think of anything, any health treatment that you ask somebody 14 months later and the effect has grown over time. I find that absolutely fascinating. Now, this study I like to share with people, partly just because I really like the title. The efficacy, tolerability, and safety of serotonergic psychedelics for the management of mood, anxiety, and substance use disorders, a systematic review of systematic reviews. I personally think that's wonderful. And it's a definitive statement in what Dos Santos shows and Dos Santos' colleagues show that psychedelics are back and they're very helpful for many different disorders. There's an image I would like to show you, but I'd like to tell you where the research comes from, which is Petri et al.'s work looking at fMRI research. And out of this study, he generated an image that's actually very common, and it's associated with many people, many slideshows show this image. And on the left-hand circle, what you see is various parts of the brain, like the purple, for example, being the visual cortex. And what you see is the visual cortex talks a lot to the visual cortex in a normal human brain and doesn't talk a lot to the other parts of the brain regularly. Under the influence of psilocybin, the different parts of the brain really communicate and form many different neural connections with other parts of the brain. Now, this is a very helpful slide in some ways because it, to some extent, I believe, explains some of the effectiveness of treatment when new neural connections get formed. But it's also an unhelpful slide because it in some ways gives people the impression that psychedelic therapy is a bit like taking your car into the garage. You just form the new neural networks and everything is fine. And it isn't true. In fact, that belief system reduces the effectiveness of the process because people really have to be involved. They have to be engaged, intensely engaged in the process. I met an individual who had schizophrenia who told me a story that was important enough that I interviewed him many times and wound up writing it up, and it's available on the MAPS Canada website. You can go and read it. And his story was fascinating. And what he said was, while large dosages of psychedelics were destabilizing to him, which is how we all think about the relationship between schizophrenia and psychedelics, he found that a microdose, a very, very small dose of LSD or psilocybin, would help. And what it would do is it would change the voices. He has voices in his head, and normally they're condemning, hostile, aggressive, and judgmental. And with a tiny amount of LSD or psilocybin, the voices become loving, kind, positive, and supportive. It's remarkable. So it was important enough that I wrote it up, and anybody can read it. You can find it on our website. I wanted to know if anybody else had ever had that same experience. So I went into the literature and I did find some things. In 1958, a study was published by a group of people who are running a support group for schizophrenics in a psychiatric hospital. It was a daily support group where they got together and just chatted. And what they found is normally the people in the group either didn't talk or they didn't talk in context what anybody else was saying. But when they gave them a very small dose of LSD, the folks that weren't talking started to talk, and then they started to talk with each other. They had a conversation. And again, it was a very small dose of LSD, which is fascinating to me. I've written a manual. It's available. You can order it from Amazon.com. It's called The Manual for Psychedelic Guides, and it's not a sales pitch. It's a very blunt description of how psychedelic guiding or psychedelic therapy actually works. And it talks about some of the really hard stuff as well. It's available on Amazon if you'd like it. What it looks like is this. This is a setup image. It's myself and my partner and some guy that I met from the gym who's huge and has tattoos. And he agreed to lie down. So what you see in this image is a male and a female who are incredibly present for the person who's lying down, who is internal. By that I mean he has eye shades on and headphones. He's also experiencing a sense of connection. I'm holding his hand. It's a beautiful environment. Roses at the back left are traditional, but there's other meditative kind of images in the room. So this is how psychedelic psychotherapy works. The provincial government has approached me to discuss how psychedelics can be integrated in the healthcare system. I am so glad to be having that discussion with them. And we're looking at how it could be integrated in a variety of different ways. We're also looking at the cost of psychedelic therapy. And here's a graph of different cost analysis, from psychoanalysis to medication management, to the MDMA treatment protocol, to psychedelic therapy with one therapist, and psychedelic therapy in groups. So what you can see is the cost of different PTSD therapies varies widely, and psychedelics can help reduce the cost. I've also written a paper on how I believe psychedelics should be regulated in a post-legalization world. It's available free online if you'd like to see it. It's called A Public Health-Based Vision for the Management and Regulation of Psychedelics. And the FDA is in a formal dispute resolution with MAPS USA around should people be allowed to have their own MDMA experience as part of the training program. Does the lead facilitator have to have an MD or a PhD, or is a master's acceptable? And does there have to be a physician on site or just on call? And all of those need to be resolved, and hopefully MAPS USA will succeed in having people have an experience of MDMA as they are trained, and then having a master's level trained therapist and not a PhD, and have a physician just on call, not on site. Here's a slide that Rick Doblin shared with me that basically said he wanted to train 200,000 therapists. I talked to him about it later, and he said that may be ambitious, but he certainly wants to train a lot of people doing psychedelic psychotherapy. The future for psychedelics, treatment of addictions, mental health concerns, spirituality, and enhancing connections. My latest book that I'm reading is called Love Drugs, The Chemical Future of Relationships, which is a fascinating exploration of how psychedelics can be used to either enhance, actually psychedelics and other substances can be used to either enhance or make relationships worse, quite frankly. Here's an image of where we're going. We're gonna have psychedelic therapy clinics in urban settings. And for those who think that's way too urban, we're also gonna have them in rural settings. One does not discover new lands without consenting to lose sight of the shore for a long time. And the saddest aspect of life now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. Thank you for your attention.
Great. So thank you so much, Mark. And last but not least, we have Dr. Tehseen Noorani. So Dr. Noorani is a research fellow in the Department of Anthropology at Durham University. He's done a lot of research around psychedelics. In particular, he conducted ethnographic research at Johns Hopkins while they were conducting research around smoking cessation using psilocybin. He's also writing a book right now on the renewed scientific and therapeutic interest in psychedelic experiences in the global north and some of the implications of this research for theories of psychopathology and approaches to mental health care. He's also currently organizing an event that's ongoing entitled Psychedelics, Madness, and Awakening. So I encourage you all to check it out online. His talk is titled Containment Matters, the Set and Setting of Psychedelic Research. And I'll hand it over to him.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to Phoebe Friesen and the other organizers of this event, which has been a long time in the coming. It's a real honor and a pleasure to speak to you here, and I hope you'll find the talk interesting. The title is Containment Matters, Set and Setting in Emerging Psychedelic Psychiatry. The art I'm using throughout this talk is from Fred Tomaselli, who's an artist who spoke at New York's Horizon Psychedelics Conference, which features a couple of times in this presentation. I'd like to begin with a quote from the late Houston Smith in 2006, commenting on the seminal early research study at the now well-known Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Research Lab. In the end, it's altered traits, not altered states, that matter. By their fruits shall we know them. It's good to learn that volunteers having even this limited experience had lasting benefits, but human history suggests that without a social vessel to hold the wine of revelation, it tends to dribble away. That's the next research question, it seems to me. What conditions of community and practice best help people to hold on to what comes to them in those moments of revelation, converting it into abiding light in their own lives? From 2013 to 2015, I worked with the Johns Hopkins researchers, conducting follow-up interviews with participants from a psychedelic-assisted smoking cessation pilot trial. We held these interviews in the session rooms where participants had spent many hours under the influence of psychedelics on a sofa. Ostensibly to help jog their memories, I found the delight with which the former participants re-entered the session room, which for some was several years after their involvement in the trial, palpable. And this experience has inspired much of what follows. Framed as efficacious, well-contained and commodifiable treatments, psychedelic-assisted therapies offer much promise for an emerging psychedelic psychiatry. Here I want to discuss the term set and setting, which is ubiquitous in the psychedelic community, and highlights the centrality of the context of psychedelic drug use for the nature of the experiences and effects engendered. I'll argue that today the term set and setting co-articulates not only epistemic and therapeutic, but also political and economic imperatives to contain psychedelic experiences. This has been especially useful as a safeguard against concerns voiced over a repeat of the history of psychedelic prohibition that began in the 1960s. For instance, consider this quote from Robert or Bob Jesse, who's an authoritative voice within the contemporary US psychedelic community and helped kickstart the Johns Hopkins psilocybin research with his behind-the-scenes work in the 90s. In 2016, Jesse explained to the audience at Horizons, New York's large psychedelics conference, that they will find the scientific research the easiest mode of psychedelic use to talk about. Quote, with your next door neighbor, your professors, the people you work with. Why? Because it gives the accurate appearance of being well contained. The sessions are safeguarded. They're conducted by trained people. The protocols are approved by institutional review boards and government regulators. The whole thing is contained so that it doesn't look like the drugs and the drug experiences are going to spill out into the streets. In other words, it's made safe to talk about and therefore easy to take in. Taking my cue from Jesse and inspired by scholarship that investigates the materiality of containers, I will show with ethnographic examples ways that psychedelic experiences leak and overflow beyond the clinical containers built around them. These excesses may index modes of therapeutic efficacy not captured by their scientific investigation through clinical trials. I'll then examine the payoff of thinking about the psychedelic revival in terms of containment by posing two qualities central to the set and setting of the emerging modality of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. The first is a labor of protecting spaces, which reveals an attentiveness to disconnection that can be read in tension with the more commonly evoked emphasis on connection found within psychedelic discourses. The second is how psychedelic as mind-manifesting experiences are understood to reflect the self, and in so doing represent epistemic disagreements about the nature of the self thus reflected. Taken together, I'll propose that these two qualities of psychedelic containment also offer an analytics for reading the contemporary cultural politics of psychedelic use. There's been a lot of debate about the role of set and setting and the extent to which the context of psychedelic use determines what subsequently happens. Often, researchers interested in the social, the historical, and the cultural are frustrated at the assumption that all the effects are somehow in the drugs themselves, but in so doing end up reducing everything the other way. In his recent analysis of set and setting in American Trip, Ido Hartogson solves this reductionism bind with a thin universalism of what the psychedelic experience in the singular does, namely an intensification of sensations and meaning, a hyper-associative mode of thinking, and a blurring of boundaries. These universal or elementary features of psychedelics are then, quote, altered, modified, inflected, and interpreted through their interactions with society and culture. Hartogson's strategy of appealing to universals that are instantiated according to local social and cultural variations reinforces the original dichotomy between drug and context. Instead, here, I'd like to refuse this reductionism bind altogether. In its place, data revealing the force of the appeals to set and setting, including the discursive effects of Hartogson's own contribution, can help us think about how the use of this term is shaping our understanding of psychedelics today. The clinical research is suggestive of different kinds of containment of the psychedelic experience, and I've elaborated on this in a paper that will be out later this year. First, there is the spatial containment in what has often been described as a living room-like setting. Second, there's a therapeutic containment, allowing for the full expression of visions, emotions, and thoughts that can then be processed through what are increasingly formalized therapeutic modalities. Acceptance commitment therapy comes to mind. And third, there's spiritual containment. And here I'm thinking in particular of ideas of the inner healer as configuring the therapeutic process in ways that can suggest it will be necessarily healing. Okay, The next section is called Medicalization as Containment. Some university-based psychedelic researchers have sought to dissuade, if not outright criticize, use beyond controlled, sanctioned environments, such as the clinical trials themselves. A deeply held concern amongst these university-based labs has been that the drugs will not be confined to particular sets and settings, that irresponsible, which can be code for recreational, use will take off, leading to another political backlash. Generally, researchers have sought to avoid the political debates, keenly not wanting what many describe as another Leary, and Danielle Giffort's recent book is great on this. By contrast, these researchers' hopes have been that the clinical trials are able to continue through controlled and legal research settings, untroubled by reports of surging community-based use or adverse effects, until such time as the trials yield enough data to warrant rescheduling of the compounds and licensing of their use. Indeed, many psychedelic researchers and therapists attribute such adverse effects precisely to having had a poor setting. The clinical trial designs are intended to develop reimbursable, targeted, and contained interventions that can be enrolled into healthcare systems once it is assumed their efficacy and safety is sufficiently evidenced in the near future. As chairman of the board of MAPS, John Gilmore put it to a Burning Man audience in 2013, quote, "It's not really science, it's jumping through hoops." For those in the psychedelic community invested in psychiatry, having the appropriate governing and regulating bodies recognize the importance of suitable settings for the therapeutic use of psychedelics inspires a secondary hope that the care over establishing safe and efficacious containers in emerging paradigms of psychedelic medicine will offer templates for a much more contextually sensitive psychiatry in general. This hope contains a redemptive promise to rectify psychiatry's over-embrace of acontextual drug-based remedies since the mid-20th century neurochemical turn. The aspirations to medicalize often sit uneasily in the wider communities of psychedelic users and advocates who were present at the conferences, workshops, and informational tents at festivals I attended during ethnographic fieldwork I conducted since working on the clinical trial. Many simply wanted to be able to use psychedelics without sanction, supporting grassroots decriminalization and legalization initiatives that have begun to grow apace across North America and beyond. Such actors embrace positions that themselves are in tension with one another, including the libertarian call for a right to cognitive liberty and social justice commitments to a politics of mutuality and intersectionality and cultural transformation. The standard response from advocates of overground research and therapy has been that medicalization is the thin end of the wedge, foreshadowing wider availability. Yet attempts at concerted action within the psychedelic community to agree on the details of how psychedelics will be made available once rescheduled have been fractious. Conference gatherings have been the site of heated disagreement. With the recent entry of venture capital and for-profit startups into the psychedelic space, the tensions between the various politics of medicalization, decriminalization, and legalization amongst scientific, underground, religious, shamanic, and indigenous communities has ratcheted up considerably. These psychedelic politics can be contrasted with those of the first wave of laboratory and clinical research and therapy in the 1950s and 60s, then primarily with LSD. By the 1960s, elitist programmatics suggested that, at least at first, psychedelics should be reserved for the carefully selected, intellectually curious, and aesthetically refined few, while populists such as Timothy Leary came to celebrate widespread use, reveling in the very uncontainability of psychedelic experiences. Both emphasize perennial forms of psychedelic mysticism marked by psychedelic-induced consciousness expansion that was unbounded, opening into spatio-temporal infinity, what literary figure Aldous Huxley coined the mind at large. These ideas undergirded the optimism that psychedelics could usher in a new age. Drug prohibitionists in the Nixon administration, who sought to rally against the increased use of psychedelics, called on experts who claimed that psychedelics were producing psychotic-like states, claims opposed by those who suggested negative psychedelic experiences such as terror, ego inflation, and grandiosity only resulted from a poor set and setting and thus do not justify the prohibition of the substances themselves. Today's medicalization-oriented researchers reflexively utilize these critiques as justification for new economic models of containment, simultaneously solving the problem of patents on psychedelic compounds being either expired or difficult to obtain. If psychedelics are only becoming known to us for what they do under particular certain settings, these medicalization advocates reason, only the protocols and settings that have been used to generate the controlled scientific knowledge of them are the ones that can and should be condoned. This provides a rationale for commodifying not the drugs alone, but whole therapeutic protocols. Reliance on set and setting, therefore, enables psychedelic psychiatry to embrace the historic failures of drug research to accommodate context. This in turn requires new training systems to be put in place for those who want to be psychedelic therapists in the near future, a current opportunity for drug sponsors and educational centers seeking to position themselves at the vanguard for when overground psychedelic therapy is legalized. To summarize, ideas of set and setting, which had been developed as ways to support experiences of unboundedness, are returning today as the precondition of economic viability. The challenge of containment for psychedelic science today, then, moves seamlessly between the need to contain psychedelic experiences and put the experiences to use in therapeutic ways, and the need to contain the substances themselves within legal spaces of research and approved therapy. Okay, in the rest of this talk, I'll draw on the preceding analysis of the braided nature of the epistemics, therapeutics, and politics of contemporary psychedelic research and therapy to think through some of the labors of containment. The next section is called Leaks and Overflows. Attempts at restricting psychedelic experiences to the settings of university-based clinical trials have been stumbling in the very unfolding of the research. The sheer immensity of the experiences produced is creating its own overflows in at least 4 ways, I'll suggest, each stoking yet further anxieties about psychedelic containment. First, the vivid and proselytizing accounts of former participants who since became advocates for the therapy they received. Jesse's address to the psychedelic community at the Horizons conference spoke to a kind of quiet conversion work, which he advised the audience should be about attraction, not promotion, evoking the 11th tradition of Alcoholics Anonymous. But even as Jesse was speaking, such accounts had begun to snowball, and today they saturate the media landscape around promising new avenues for psychiatry, alternative and holistic medicine. The media attention has been a double-edged sword for psychedelic researchers, on the one hand leading to increased research funding and receptivity across many publics for psychedelic research, while on the other hand threatening to negatively affect the efficacy of the clinical trial treatments by complicating enrollment and confounding the results of trials currently underway. These looping effects are particularly large in the case of psychedelic drugs because of their sensitivity to set and setting. This raises questions about the changing nature of participants' expectations and the lack of study of disappointment effects in relation to these ever more exciting therapeutics. Secondly, during the past decade, clinical trial research has also fed into, galvanized, and in turn benefited from the formation of community-based psychedelic societies. The first US-based psychedelic society in the current wave was started by Daniel Jabor in San Francisco in 2011, who, in penning an article for the MAPS newsletter in 2014, called for readers to set up more psychedelic societies. Fast forward 6 years and an online resource lists 168 psychedelic societies across 36 countries, with the majority in the US, followed by Canada and the UK. Some former trial participants come to their local psychedelic societies in search of community. Indeed, one of Johns Hopkins' lead therapists, Mary Cosimano, who has guided sessions there for 20 years, describes actively signposting participants to psychedelic societies as places to find community and keep integrating their experiences. Today's 8 activist organizers at the center of the Baltimore Psychedelic Society include 2 former trial participants. Thirdly, psychedelic experiences in the context of clinical therapeutics also generate deep connections between participants and their study teams, in particular with their therapist guides. I use that interchangeably, therapist and guides. These connections, often attributed therapeutic potency in themselves in the clinical research literature, fed friendships and wider community networks around the research trials. On the eve of the summer solstice of 2013, lead author of the now famous 2011 openness study at Hopkins, Catherine McLean, joined with experimental musician, psychonaut, and former trial participant Twig Harper, and local newspaper contributor and magical thinker Michael Hughes to inaugurate the It Is group, described in their email publicity as, quote, a salon in the spirit of American mysticism, hosted at Tarantula Hill, Harper's West Baltimore home. This was an early example of a gathering intended for the sharing of psychedelic experiences people had both inside and outside of Hopkins' research trials. In other cases, the distance between the university research and illicit community-based use has been carefully managed, such as when in 2017, a Hopkins psychedelic researcher agreed to help the Baltimore Psychedelic Society devise the format and guidelines of regular integration group sessions only on condition of anonymity. Fourthly, those whose primary work has been as clinical trial researchers, therapists, and guides often deeply believe in the intrinsic value of carefully contained psychedelic experiences. Many are engaging in activities and creating new forms of value in community-based projects to the side of their primary work. These include setting up non-profit and charitable organizations to offer signposting and distill best practices from across community-based and clinical work, and working in harm reduction, for example, volunteering at festivals where psychedelics are being used. McLean left her tenure-track position and co-founded the Psychedelic Education and Continuing Care Program in New York in 2015, profiled at the Horizons conference the following year for its pioneering community integration group model. McLean describes the model as a ripple outwards from the specific support structures devised at Hopkins by Cosimano for participants in the high support arm of a research study that ended in 2013, which administered the psychedelic psilocybin to spiritual practitioners. Today, psychedelic integration groups have been set up across North America and beyond, though largely, I think, in the Anglophone global North, where participants from clinical trials, psychedelic drug tourists, and illicit underground psychedelic users come together and discuss intense psychedelic experiences, what they have come to mean, and their subsequent impact. When attending Baltimore Psychedelic Society meetings about 5 years ago, I found conversations very oriented around the Hopkins clinical trial research. When I was invited to speak in the summer of 2015 about my research then underway at the university, I met people who had participated in other such research trials. I came to learn that there were many Baltimoreans who knew each other either before or since taking part in Hopkins studies. The university had been sourcing participants from a local community that was already loosely knit together. The staged separation between the legal overground trials and underground activities put into question by the ways the research trials, which made Baltimore the preeminent city on the psychedelic Renaissance map, help consolidate underground relationships and communities further, with the need for participants inflaming and sanctioning a collectivized underground of psychonauts being seen by the regulatory and legal authorities to be containing psychedelic use has proven to be work. While psychedelic researchers have articulated the importance of working within the constraints provided by the current regulatory systems to quietly and without any serious adverse effects demonstrate that psychedelic experiences have great worth, The research program and practice has shaped much of its local environments in the form of extraclinical activity, ongoing modes of integration support, and psychedelic societies where researchers, therapists, and former participants develop new socialities with a host of other psychedelic aficionados. These leaks and overflows from the constraints of a particular set and setting index different failures and attempts to determine drug effects. It could conversely be interpreted to show how the so-called psychoactivity, life-altering capacities, or potential for healing of contemporary psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies resides in the wider milieu, destabilizing the claim of the randomized controlled trial methodology to locate efficacy within the substances themselves. Okay, the next section is called Protection and Reflection. The boundaries that are rhetorically and materially erected and maintained around the set and setting of clinical research in the psychedelic Renaissance also shape particular qualities of the container. I want to propose two such qualities, protection and reflection. So, protection. I've come to think of participants' experiences in overground psychedelic research trials as constituted not only through invitations, but through exclusions and refusals that work to protect the spaces thereby contained. At Hopkins, participants are asked to take off their shoes and turn off their phones. The space offers no indication of the time, which instead is bookended by their arrival into the care of their two-session therapists and being picked up 6 to 8 hours later by a pre-designated friend or family member. Participants are made fully aware that consumption of an otherwise illegal drug is not illegal in the clinical trials zone of exception. On dosing days, participants get to leave the humdrum of daily concerns at the threshold to the session door. While much of the media discourse around psychedelics refers to the breaking down of walls and a celebration of interconnection, we might note the paradox that this only occurred through an ethic of exclusion made possible by the establishing and active maintenance of the container's own walls. The standard interpretation of the value of psychedelic experiences has been in terms of entry into a larger world, coining the term psychedelic in reference to their supposed mind-manifesting nature in 1957. Psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond insisted that they are not escapes from, but enlargements burgeoning of reality, an idea which continues to be cited in the recent revival of scientific research. Yet the protective properties of the container are suggestive instead of a centripetal value in the therapeutic modality, creating spaces protected from the stress and distress of everyday life. This includes demands on attention and labor and toxic environments. It enables participants to be vulnerable and receptive to their experiences on the sofa. These demands, which allow one to get away from it all in order to kind of get into it all, surely contribute to the significant overrepresentation of white participants being enrolled into psychedelic science trials. And on this, see this paper by Michaels et al. From 2018. Recently voiced critiques within the psychedelic community have argued that psychedelic science is mostly benefiting normative, privileged populations while using these sample groups to make universal claims about the action of psychedelics on the human being as such, a repeat of broader social scientific concerns with skewed clinical knowledge production writ large. A recognition of the attention and labor required to sufficiently protect these spaces also helps explain the magnitude of the betrayal felt individually and collectively in the psychedelic community when reports have surfaced of breaches in the duty of care, in particular in relation to cases of sexual harm. Secondly, I suggest the set and setting reflects the self even as it shapes it. The reflective function of the container echoes the very etymology of the psychedelic experience, that a priori it is contained within us, mind as manifestable. In the clinical research sites, practices of mirroring take on an important role, encouraging curiosity through reflecting back to the participants what they communicate. A technique used in psychedelic research at Spring Grove Hospital in Maryland in the 1960s and 70s was to offer participants a handheld mirror at especially charged moments during a session for them to literally encounter their own reflection. At this point, we might ask, who claims that psychedelics are reflecting us back to us? What notion of us is this? And what labor must go into the building and maintaining of containers that enable us to be alone with ourselves? It's important to recognize the collective and feminized aspects of this infrastructural work. And Sarah Shorthall has written about this in relation to the use of psychedelics in the 1960s US counterculture in this article, which I recommend. Meanwhile, regarding the us in question, the psychedelic mysticism operative in contemporary psychedelic science has highly prized a unitive consciousness that sublimates the dualism of self and other. Literature produced in a neuroscientific lexicon posits that with psychedelics, the self is able to experience itself directly through neither the other nor the ego. According to the most common trope to emerge from the neuroscientific literature in recent years, this self-consciousness has been tied to the activity of the human brain's default mode network, whose identification as the seat of the ego has been celebrated in the coverage of psychedelic science. Combining computational and psychoanalytic registers, prominent psychedelic researcher Robin Carhart-Harris and neuroscientist Carl Friston recently argued that the ego be more accurately understood as the highest level of extant predictions the brain as modeler has about the world. By loosening these predictions through the deactivation of the default mode network, psychedelics allow a more expansive self to manifest. Huxley's mind at large returns as an individualized brain at large. But other notions of the self circulating in psychedelic therapeutics are deeply peopled with others, consistent with evidence that the default mode network is central for how we think about others, theory of mind, and the narrative self. Such peopled minds have more in common with what Eric Davis has recently called a pessimistic gnosis, which he argues is alive and well in the psychedelic underground. Dialectical models of self, reproduced through the gaze of others, may better account for the experiences of non-normative participants coming into the clinical trials. In reaction to the disproportionate whiteness of the demographics of psychedelic trial participants, in 2018, MAPS hired Monica Williams, an African-American clinical psychologist and specialist in racial trauma, as principal investigator of the Connecticut site of their open-label phase 2 clinical trials. Williams's team brought a racial trauma lens to understanding the experiences and pathologies of trial participants, and her team sought to adapt the study protocol in culturally sensitive ways. The site was closed early for myriad reasons, including structural racism and sexism. Disappointing, but perhaps unsurprising given systemic inequalities. What this reveals is how the racial and gender politics of the contemporary psychedelic revival can be traced through the kinds of self that psychedelic experiences are purported to reflect back. The word container means to hold together, which is one way of getting at the value of interconnectedness, commonly espoused as a key insight of psychedelic experiences. Drawing out different meanings of container making, therefore, offers to complicate the psychedelic discourse celebrating interconnection. Indeed, practices of protection and of reflection recapitulate two jostling cultural politics of safe spaces within the psychedelic community: call out or cancel culture and transformative justice practices. In relation to calling out, naming and organizing against sexual harm, patriarchy, and white supremacy has risen up in the psychedelic movement in recent years, crystallizing around the white cis male guru or cult leader. There has been a growth of spaces that are necessarily exclusive, enabling a safety premised on that protectedness, including non-white, people of color-led, women-only, and women-led psychedelic events and groups. There has also been a growth of practices of transformative and restorative justice, calling in perpetrators for accountability, reflection, and self-refashioning. It is not the case that calling out and transformative justice are aligned with protection and reflection respectively. For instance, calling out has operated through the perhaps unrecognizable images of us reflected back to us, while transformative justice requires a degree of exclusion in order for transformation to occur, just as the walls of the crucible afford transformative heat and pressure. Okay. So, as a conclusion, as politically, epistemically, and therapeutically useful, the deployment of set and setting within psychedelic spaces enables the term to do the work of policing where psychedelics are and should be used, while articulating anxieties about containment at different scales. It's, I think, a historical question to what extent the uncontainability of psychedelic experiences itself arises from their history of associations with societal breakdown and madness, making their containment especially pressing today. I would love to hear Erika and Mark's thoughts on that. What I hope to have shown is that today's professionalizing and medicalizing drive within psychedelic therapeutics and the social justice-oriented cultures often opposed to it both partake of a turn away from the emphasis on the unboundedness of the mystical as articulated by Huxley, Leary, and others. Even the interest in the mystical experience as a mechanism of change in the therapeutic use of psychedelics is only insofar as it bears fruit in the form of long-term self-transformation. For mysticism to play any role in today's psychedelic renaissance, it seems it can no longer remain unbounded. Through insistence on instating and managing the proper set and setting, psychedelic containers can be analyzed in terms of how they leak and overflow, protect and reflect. Proliferating lists and discussions on the work of integration suggest the value of today's therapeutic psychedelic experiences lies as much in the endurance of Huston Smith's abiding light, what Huston Smith has called the abiding light of an experience as its initial cultivation. And yet, indexed in the growth of local integration services, community-based integration work is rendered invisible by measuring apparatuses which are designed around the imperatives of the randomized controlled trial and do not probe such dynamics. Huston Smith's provocative question to the psychedelic research scientists remains, I think, unanswered. At the same time, the shifting histories underlying the debates around set and setting invite the question of whether all practices of containment entail particular ways of seeing ourselves and protecting ourselves. Whether limited to psychedelics or more broadly, the political and ethical stakes lie in the possibilities opened up by considering practices aimed at protecting spaces as, at the same time, material and relational crafts for cultivating and proliferating modes of reflection. Okay, that's it. Well, thank you for listening again. And again, here's the link to the art from Fred Tomaselli, which you've seen throughout this presentation, which I really recommend. Thank you all, and look forward to the discussion.
So thank you so much to Tess for that last really fascinating talk. And I just want to thank everyone for watching these videos and remind you once again that we're going to have a live Q&A with our 3 panelists on February 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can find all of that information on our website and the registration link. So thank you so much and hope to see many of you there.